Hi, and welcome to another episode of From Surviving to Thriving. Today, my guest is Dr. Neal Lester. He is on staff at Arizona State University, and he is the founding director of Project Humanities. I could tell you a lot about Dr. Lester. You know why? Because he is, let me show you. Look at that. All of this bio for Dr. Lester. He is an extremely learned man. He is, like I say, my go-to person when it comes to talking about culture, African-American culture, and cultural appropriation. I call this episode What's in a Name? Because it's kind of a continuation of our discussion about race and even reconciliation. And we're getting ready to talk about not only the N-word, but cultural appropriation and everything that involves. So stick with me as we talk with Dr. Neal Lester, the director of Project Humanities, and we talk about what's in a name.
Okay.
So, hi, Dr. Lester. Good to have you with us.
Hello, Pastor Stewart. Thank you for coming back for more.
Yes. I am excited about this conversation that we are going to have. One, because I have always enjoyed talking to you and hearing your thoughts on things that are happening in the world, especially as it relates to African Americans and culture and all of that. And to me, you are my resident expert. So.
Oh, well, that's a tall order. I hope I can live up to that.
I believe you can, because I think you're always very thoughtful about the topics that come up from the opportunities that we've had to serve together. So that's why I really appreciate your opinion on things, because they're really just not off the cuff. They are really thoughtful. You think about these things. So let's start. Let's start with the N-word. Can we just start right there?
Oh, yes.
Well, let me ask my question. Let me ask it before you dive in, because I know you have a lot on this particular word, but many of us have been transfixed over this new Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, and her thoughts on the N-word, and that it does not make the marketplace hostile. In fact, I'm going to quote what she says. I have the quote. It says, "The N-word is an egregious racial epithet," Barrett wrote in Smith versus Illinois Department of Transportation. That said, Smith can't win simply by providing that the word was uttered. He must also demonstrate that Colbert's use of the word altered the conditions of an employment and created a hostile or abusive working environment. So she's basically implying that just because you use the N-word in a work place does not make the workplace hostile. And I believe this was from a supervisor to an employee. And many of us are horrified at the thought of that. So give us your thoughts on her ruling in that particular case, her judgment on that particular case.
Well, in the context of some of the other stuff, and it's hard to take one little piece out of some of the other racial comments that have been made during this session. And that in particular comes from a perspective of someone who has not been on the receiving end of that, and also someone who clearly doesn't know the history of that word in a way that's meaningful. There are all kinds of ways in which one could sort of pretzel twist into trying to say, well, in this circumstance, it's not. In this circumstance, it is. For example, if someone were in a classroom and you were playing, as I do, The Last Poets, that word comes out. I'm not saying it, but the audio is saying it, or at least playing it. Would that be a hostile environment? In the context of that, the answer would be no. I don't know. I mean, I tell students, for example, that we're not going to say it. But if we bring it in as part of a text, as part of a historical context, then I can see how we couldn't make a sweeping generalization about that. The problem with that is that the context of that comment from this nominee speaks to some of the other things that we have seen and heard about race, though. And one was this suggestion that somehow there's no conversation with their children until George Floyd, when in fact they have two adopted Black children.
Yeah.
If you're just having a conversation with those kids with George Floyd, I'm wondering, what have you done before? And then I also read, and I don't know how true this is, this comment that when pressed on this by one of the other senators, the response was, well, I haven't really studied it and I can't name X, Y, and Z that have to do with race. That's disturbing to me. So in the context of all of that, I can understand, but from the sort of everyday position and perspective that this is often used in a workplace in order to intimidate or to harass, then that to me is as powerful as hanging a noose on a door.
Right, right.
So to me, it's the context of all the stuff, the adopted children from Haiti and this sort of potential white saviorism that is going on. So I'm not surprised by that because we have heard other racially problematic things coming from all kinds of leadership at all different levels, locally, nationally.
Everywhere.
Everywhere.
And I think many of us of color, especially African Americans, we can recall the first time we were ever called the N-word by someone other than someone in our race. So before I even deal with that, help me understand why younger people especially, but not necessarily young people, because there are older people who use the N-word quite liberally when talking to people that they're kindred with. Right. Why is it acceptable, or is it acceptable in that context? We think about how we name ourselves, and we'll get into some of these other ways that we name ourselves, but that word really sticks out and causes even our white counterparts confusion, because they're like, well, especially if they're just repeating lyrics to a rap song that has it, and they'll be like, yeah, and they'll get to it. And Black people are like, whoa, you're not allowed to say that. Well, who actually is allowed and why is it allowed?
Right. Well, when you said that, I immediately thought of Kendrick Lamar and the contradiction, hypocrisy in writing a song with the words, but you're in a concert and a white attendee at the concert is deciding to get up on the stage, and then you stop them. And I'm thinking, okay, so there are a couple of things going on. There's an inner group, outer group conversation that is always a case. What I can say about my family member is certainly not something that you, as my nuclear family member, can say. Now, we as Black folks in a family can say certain things like your mama jokes. We know that's literal, but somebody on the outside doesn't understand that, in the same way that there was such ununderstanding or unawareness of VP candidate Kamala Harris's facial expressions.
Yes.
Those spoke volumes to Black folks who knew exactly what was going on. For the people outside, they were like, what is going on with her? Why is she doing that? We knew exactly why she's doing that. So to the N-word, I think there's a way in which Black folks have been misled, my opinion, about this word, and somehow thinking that since the early 80s in NWA that you can take a word back. Well, as I mentioned before, you can't take something back that you never owned. That word in and of itself was not a word that Black people gave ourselves. That was a word that was given to us. And no matter what Tupac says, with an acronym that probably 2 people on the planet can remember what those letters stand for. And no matter what Kendrick Lamar says in terms of NEGUS being kings from Ethiopia, I'm saying, well, where are the queens and the children? So there's a way in which those particular theories make no sense to me based on the research I have done. The research that I have done suggests that, yes, in the 1500s, in that early encounter between Europeans and Africans, that Portuguese and Spanish identified the Black other as negro, which meant Black. Now, identifying something as other means that it is not like you. And typically that othering means that it is negative. So with that descriptor negro, which means Black, came all these things that are still connected with Black today: criminal, unattractive, unintelligent.
Right.
All those things that we know, even in the language, blackball, blacklist, black market, black magic.
Yes.
All of those things are still wrapped in that word. So whether you call somebody or not, that word cannot be sort of it can't be squeezed so that you take all that ugliness out. By 1619, it was clearly disparaging. And people will say, well, Black people used it among themselves, even those who were enslaved. And I say, well, that's not surprising, because those who were enslaved were also comparing who had the best master, recognizing the pathetic nature of that circumstance when one does not own oneself. So I'm not surprised at that. I'm also thinking that there's been some misunderstanding in that memo that I personally never got about taking that word back. It's been now a term of endearment.
Right.
That's all I can hear. Nobody can give me anything else except that term of endearment. Well, if I'm in an endearing relationship with somebody, that is not what I'm going to call you.
Right. Right.
So,
it's interesting, because the N word amongst men is almost kind of like the B word that is now resonating amongst women.
Well, except take it to another level, though, because I'm going to push back on that, Pastor. And here's what I'm going to say.
Okay.
I'm going to say the N word is an equal opportunity epithet. And it is not gendered, it is not classed, it is not based on sexual identity.
Correct.
And there are little books, children's books, that have 10 little N-word boys. You're never going to have 10 little B's or 10, and you wouldn't call a baby that. A B is about behavior and gender. This is across the board. It's an equal opportunity. So they're not little songs about 1 little, 2 little, 3 little B's, or eeny, meeny, miny, mo, ketchup. Do you see what I'm saying? So
yes.
It's not quite the same. Yes. And I think that's also one of the things that people say is just like this, just like that.
Well, I guess I was really just putting it in a modern context, not a historical context, but I do see your point. But they're both disparaging. How do we get there as African-American beautiful people? How do we get to a place where these disparaging terms are now endeared to us? I mean, trust me, I don't want any of my girlfriends saying that's my B,
Right. Well, and even that, though, think about that. I remember this spoken word poet. His name is Julian Curry. And he
last name. That is mine.
That is your, and it may be a relative of yours. Look him up.
All Currys.
He's good, because what's good about this is he takes us back to the historical moment of building Wall Street. And he says, "What's up, my?" And he said, that's exactly what masters did when they saw those enslaved people building Wall Street, is they would walk up to them on that site and say, "What's up, my?" And of course, the enslaved person would do exactly what Frederick Douglass did when Mr. Covey came up to him. He said, "Oh, I'm fine, Master. How are you today?" So I'm saying that in and of itself, that my, notice that there was a certain leader of our country who also pointed out in a crowd where's my African American? Do you remember that? It was in one of those rallies. So there's an ownership there. You're absolutely right in pointing out that this is gendered. This is something that is about a masculinist performance and the ways in which Black men have been disparaged, killed, suffocated, choked, all of those things. And somehow this language is a grasping on to something that suggests, when we talk about this, because this is not in all rap music, it's in gangsta rap.
Yeah.
But notice also, and this is what I am often asking my audiences, if we can absorb that, and a song is never just about that word, then what about the misogyny? What about the capitalism? What about all those other things, the homophobia? Are we also absorbing those? Yeah. And as to whether or not white people can say it or not, I have not run into one white person who was confused about this. The white people they disagree with it because there's something they can't say. And I say, well, in my talks, you can say this, as Paul Mooney says, until the cows come home, until your teeth get white. I said, but there may be social consequences to it. It's not exactly, criminal to say it.
Right.
Recognize that you can't give a pass to anybody, nor can you get a pass from anybody. So just beware that somebody is listening. And I will say this, the first time I was called that was actually during one of our homeless outreach outings, which was in the last 5 years, because I didn't grow up with it in my house. And I grew up with Black folks all my life, and it was just never used. And So in this particular context, this young man, we were doing our homeless outreach, and we have rules, and we try to make it orderly. And this young man was on a bike, and he didn't want to wait in line to get a pair of shoes. So he kind of zipped in and said, I want these shoes. And I said, well, you need to zip over there in the line like everybody else. And then that's when he started calling me that word. And I thought, and he wasn't using it endearingly. That I knew. And at that time, he was also spelling it with the A, because there's this ridiculous choreography that we feel like we have to explain, like, oh, is it the hard R, or is it the GA or the GER? And I keep saying, but that doesn't matter, because the root of the word is the same. The root of the word is the same. And there's an 1859 novel by Harriet Wilson, the first African-American novel, we believe, by this woman, and it's called Our NIG. So you don't need the GA, you don't need the GER. And one final thing is, when President Obama was running for re-election, there was a very popular decal and t-shirt that said 2012, don't RE-NIG. So that's what I'm saying. There's so much evidence of this, that other term of endearment is all somebody can leave on the table. If you're endearing to somebody, I wouldn't walk up to you or the other pastor and say, what's up, that's disrespectful. That's, and keep in mind also, we Black folks have a lot of stuff Du Bois calls double consciousness, where we internalize how other people feel about us with contempt. And we often feel contempt for people who look like us ourselves. So there's a lot of trauma that has led to this notion of how do we express and how do we use a language that we didn't define ourselves. We called ourselves African American. We called ourselves Black. We capitalized the N. Now we're capitalizing the B. That's very different from that word.
Yeah. I am taken aback at the first time you were ever called that was about 5 years ago. That's amazing, because I was in 6th grade, and I bet people are putting in the chat the first time they recall that. And so it stings and sticks. How do we shake people out of using the term? Is there a way we can help educate to start the conversation about why we should not be using that word as how we name ourselves?
Right. Well, I will say this, that was not the first time. That was the first time I'd been called. That was not the first time I had heard it, though.
Correct. Correct.
Directed toward me, because my best friend and now spouse, we were in graduate school and merely walking out of a movie as best friends, and she was called an N-word lover.
Oh my.
So that's the other thing that makes this word different than someone else.
Right.
And he used that word as an adjective. There's something called N-word brown. So there's a way in which part of this is about educating, but also realizing that there are other ways for us to claim our dignity and humanity than words that still to this day are used to humiliate us. And what's so bizarre about this is that there are social media examples that I have pulled together where Black folks are calling white people that when they're upset with them. Like there's one of a Black man being pulled over for speeding, and he's so upset with this white officer that he's calling him that. And it's distinctly with the GA. So what does that mean if we're saying that it's a term of endearment, and we got to figure out what the choreography is and listen very carefully to whether it was a GA or that? To me is a lot of jumping around in gymnastics to try to figure it out. Let it go. Let it go.
Right.
There are so many things that are important to us. How are we treated? That's what's important to us, not necessarily that. And if that's all we can do to hold on to, that's a very sad state of affairs.
That's a sad state. Well, the words that popped into my mind when you said that it was a white person using that term, or a Black person using, you said Black
white person
term to a white person, is
and angry about it, not using it as an endearment.
Yeah, it just goes to solidify the fact that it is just negative terminology, and we recognize it as negative terminology, and you just can't twist the word back and forth and say it's positive here and it's negative there, which is what is, it's like, we're gonna flip it. Okay, it's good. And how does the person know? Is it your tone of voice? Is it your inflection? Oh yeah, if I say it and my inflection is up at the end, that means it's good. But my inflection is down at the end, no, that's bad.
That's a whole lot of energy.
That's a
Just
lot.
let it go. And it's interesting because that's what people have to do, though. In fact, when we had that, oh gosh, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago, the school that's in my neighborhood, the high school where the young women decided they were going to spell it out.
Yes.
Well, one of the Black respondents to that, one of the classmates said, "Oh, I didn't think it was a problem until I saw how it was spelled." See, that needs some education there. And the school didn't necessarily want me to talk to those kids because, I'm right here in the backyard, and somebody recommended, well, why don't you have this person come in? The parents didn't want me talking to the kids. So after this was all said and done, I ended up doing a session with the administrators, but this was long after the students. So this is not just about the kids. This is about parents too. Don't want, white parents who don't want their kids having this conversation. And trust me, the youngest audience that I've actually had this conversation with was probably third graders locally, because the word is there as well.
The word transcends all the way down. It is something you hear early. Even though the first time I was called it was in the 6th grade, I heard it much earlier, and I heard it as a negative. Negatively, and I heard it amongst our people positively. So it is not something that you are immune to.
Well, think about all those ways in which intra-racism plays out. And I'm thinking that I don't know how we separate that from that. We still discriminate based on skin color. We still discriminate based on hair. We don't always honor those who look like us, because we have lived in a society that is anti-Black, and that is associated with anti-Black if somebody gets angry about it. And one thing that I did in a conversation recently, a dad of a 13-year-old who said in the Deep South, who says that he uses it. We were both on the panel. He says he uses it, but said he realized one day he was upset with his 13-year-old daughter, and it came out of his mouth to her, and he was angry. And that was the point that he realized that he could not have that word come out of his mouth if he was trying to model some kind of, use of language, and how we don't want to try to take a word that then we have to flip and twist, as you just pointed out, in order to have different meanings in different contexts. It's not worth the energy. We should be doing so much other stuff with our energies. And we are creative with words. That I can, hands down, we are creative with words. That's why other folks are appropriating our words.
Now that leads right to where I wanted to go, because as you were talking about Black culture, and we were talking about Blackness and the antithesis and relationship that we have with people who are not Black, but there's all this appropriation. So first, I want you to give us a real definition of what cultural appropriation is.
Right. Cultural appropriation is stealing something from someone and getting credit for it.
Well, that's pretty plain.
and it's stealing from people who are less powerful and who are typically marginalized and subordinate.
Okay, so give me some tangible examples of what cultural appropriation is.
Cultural appropriation is blackface.
Okay.
This is a white man named T.D. Rice who saw an enslaved Black person and decided that he wanted to be entertainment for other white people. So he was going to dress up as this tattered enslaved person and blacken his face and dance around as entertainment.
Okay.
So they took an identity and doctored it up for the sake of funny entertainment, humiliating. Okay. Cultural appropriation is also Flip Wilson, where you take men who dress up as women, not in an art form that you might attribute to RuPaul, for example, where this is a performance. I'm talking about for the sake of funny. Jamie Lee Foxx does it, Tyler Perry does it, and that shows the degree to which humor comes out of making fun of women.
Mm.
So that's cultural appropriation too.
And I know you have just shook the listener, because many of us have watched all of Jamie Foxx,
and Tyler Perry, Mud Deer.
And we've watched everyone you named. I've seen and I've laughed at.
Of course.
As a woman, not even recognizing that I'm laughing at a man who is making fun of a female stereotype.
Right. That is a stereotype. That's where the issue is. It's relegated to a stereotype, and that's what these costumes are. You can go to the spirit store. I do that annually, because I go to the spirit store and see what the latest appropriation is, and they're Nicki Minaj, Kim Kardashian, with big pillows in their bottoms. It's meant to make fun of people. It's meant to steal, to take away something. There's also a cultural appropriation that you get in music, where it's not always about funny, but it's actually about real profit. Look at Elvis Presley and the ways in which Elvis Presley was hugely popular among white people because he could do and perform blackness, but still be white. And then I remember hearing an NPR story about Elvis's hair. Now, Elvis's hair was actually based on Black men during that time who were performers slicking their hair down, as Malcolm X did with the conch. But the Black men who were doing that in order to imitate the white folks. So Elvis Presley had this double layer of appropriation, taking something and not getting credit for it. And asked Little Richard about who the king of rock and roll would be. And you'd say, well, why is he getting the credit for it? Why, for example, is Madonna the one that we know associated with Vogue, Strike a Pose, Vogue, 1990, but yet it was Black queer men in New York who actually created voguing. And their voguing is not as sanitized, but they never hit the international stage the way Madonna did. Or think of Betty Boop, Boop Boopy Doo. That was a Black jazz woman in the 1920s, but white audiences didn't want to see a Black woman. So this white woman saw her and absorbed that performance and became the Betty Boop that we know. Cultural appropriation everywhere.
It's everywhere. So how do we discern between someone who's not trying to appropriate? So when you talk about Madonna, and I'm not trying to sterilize or sanitize if she actually did appropriate, as you were saying, but how do you know it's appropriation as opposed to she liked what she saw, she did it, and because she had the platform, it blew up? Would it have been necessary for her to give a attribution? This is where I got this from, as opposed to it's just a dance craze and I was doing the dance and that's it. How do we?
And maybe pay the people who created it. Like Jack Daniels, for example. We know now through historical research that the actual enslaved person that created the recipe for Jack Daniels never got the money from him, but the white family that owned him did. That's what we talk about appropriation. So there are ways in which you can appreciate something, but don't have to perform it. Appropriation is as much about performance. And I sometimes think about that. In fact, I thought of this when I put this shirt on. I talked to you about this last time is, Black folks can perform Africa. And if we know Africa and you understand it, the performance is not a performance. But if it's something like Benitha has in A Raisin in the Sun, which I just taught in my class, where she asks somebody, what is Africa? He gives her, Asega, a couple of, lessons about it. And all of a sudden she's like the African queen. That's appropriating too. So there's a way in which this is about performance. It's about the way in which your connection to whatever you're performing is just superficial. And the same thing with language, though. Here's an example. You probably heard about this too, because, mainstream America, another way that LGBTQ can appropriate from Black folks. I've heard some white gay men, using language like yes and all these like the B word as though they are women. And I heard one say he had a Black woman trapped inside of him. That's supposed to be funny. And somebody called him out on that. Or even that yes, for example, people kept saying, oh, that comes from gay culture and Lady Gaga. I was like, no, that doesn't. I said, I can tell you, I've taped a church service at Tanner, and those Black women say yes all the time. And yet we don't credit that as part of the culture. And you've heard this in your church when people are calling and responding. But who gets the credit for it? Who gets the credit for it? Who's getting paid for it? And it's not the Black folks or the other minoritized folks.
So it's really appropriated when the attribution to origin lands on a culture where it did not originate from.
And people aren't being compensated for it.
And compensation.
Got to add that, because you're exploiting. It's sort of like stealing. Okay, somebody cheats on a test. Now they get credit for it, but it's your work.
Got it.
That's what it is. It's stealing, and we've got that over the years. You know, Pat Boone stole stuff from Little Richard. Who's the one that gets the credit for it? Dances, twerking. Why do we know Miley Cyrus is twerking? Black women been twerking. In fact, we were doing the butt, and it was sort of a form of twerking, right? But who? Now, see, the only thing that's exciting about that is that Black people can create, and out of all this pain and violence and suffering, something has come out of this, blues and jazz. But even that, though, is not something that we can own, because people can borrow it. They can steal it. They can somehow sound like, I remember Iggy Azalea. She was like hot for a moment with Fancy, but she was using a black scent. And her black scent was, she was trying to sound like Salt and Pepper. But the problem was when she, from Australia, was talking as herself, she didn't sound like that. So that was a performance. That was like blackface through voices. You know, Chet Hanks, Tom Hanks' son, who does rap, he has to take on this persona of a Black person in order to do that. But the reality is that he is still white, and he is still not able to sort of get rid of his white privilege. You know, same thing with hair. You know, you go to these cruises, and white women will stop off and get their hair braided. Well, look at the hair discrimination that happens in the workforce still, that we have to have a Crown Act to keep Black women mostly from being discriminated based on their hair. That's what appropriation is.
So does it, now that you're on hair, does it work in the reverse? Because many of the ladies, we wear hair that is not our own in an attempt for many reasons.
Right.
Some of us because we are really wanting protective styles because we don't want to mess up our hair. So we manage to use somebody else's head to help out our own hair. Would that be considered? Because I've often wondered, is that appropriation in reverse?
Well,
if
think
there's
about
a reverse appropriation.
That's almost like asking people about reverse racism. Reverse racism doesn't exist because this is about power. This is about the power dynamics. Black women have never been in a position to have power over white women, ever, in any systemic way. So it's the same sort of thing that you would ask, you know, when those Wayans brothers did White Chicks. Well, there again is the appropriation of gender in a way that's supposed to be for funny, but they did it as white. Well, the reality is that there's not a tradition in our American history of Black people imitating white, and Black people never had any power over white people. The opposite is not true, because white people had the power to kill us and to relegate us to Jim Crow law.
And still do.
And get away with it. So that's what I'm saying. You got to talk about this in terms of power, because Black people can appropriate also. You know, Beyonce is guilty of appropriating all kinds of things, from music to costumes, Orientalism, but she's got money and can do that from people who are less, who don't have as much and can't fight against her when they're stealing stuff. Robin Thicke, for example, stole, you know, some of Blurred Lines, but the court was able to sort of do that. So people are stealing, and you know, the tricky part, and you need to be in the music industry to do this. You know, when people are sampling, that's different. That's a different conversation. We're talking just I'm going to go to India and I'm going to, you know, put a bindi on, which is what Selena Gomez did. No understanding of the culture because it was cool. And around Halloween is when we really found a lot of this. You can also appropriate old people. You know, Saturday Night Live does it all the time. If you're going to talk about old people, all you got to do is bring out a walker, and you got to hobble. That's appropriating also.
Okay, so I have, no, you sparked.
Stop performing. That's what the issue is. Stop performing. You can appreciate it and not perform it.
So I have been to India. Been to India twice. Probably will go again. We have a sister church there, Calvary Baptist Church, that we are in partnership with. And the first trip I went, so they bought me a sari that I still have, cannot fit, praise God, for COVID pounds, but I have it in my closet because I love it. It is
beautiful.
Absolutely beautiful. In fact, I have two.
Right.
And I have some Indian style garments that I bought while I was there, and I still wear them. They are extraordinarily comfortable and cool. So I wear them just because I love them. But while I was there, one of the daughters did henna painting of my hands. And it was just a beautiful, I had absolutely no understanding of what it meant. But she asked me if I wanted it, and I was like, sure. And I did it. So would you say, in my ignorance of what the henna on my hands meant, I still have pictures of it. Yeah. It was fabulous.
Right. Well,
Did I appropriate?
In my honest response, yes.
I got big girl. I'm a big girl. I can tell.
In my honest response, did the world stop because you did it? The answer is no. But the answer that I say about all of this is once we know, we can't unknow that. Because I've got a shirt that I really like, and somebody told me that it was a Mexican wedding shirt. I love that shirt. But because I know that, I can't unknow that. And I can't go around not trying to practice what I'm trying to teach. And so once I know, I'm just not going to do it myself. But I'm not going to go calling out other people. That's your business if you decide. But you ask me what is, it's about a performance. And what you acknowledge is that people dress up in these costumes, and there's a movement called My Culture is Not a Costume. My culture is not a costume. There are people who are suffering. You know, Justin Trudeau and his family did it. Now, if the family that's hosting you invites you in to do it, that's one thing.
That's what happened, Dr.
Okay, but that's different. But if you just sort of like decide you're going to wear it to FIBC one Sunday and stand up in the pulpit and preach, then and just put a bindi on because it feels like it's a thing to do, then some people may be wondering about your commitment to sort of cultural awareness and cultural competence.
So I understand when the articles that we have on actually have religious or some sort of spiritual or deep meaning associated with them. But what about my Indian garments? I literally bought them in a department store in India. I don't wear the sari, because I don't have the figure for it anymore, praise God.
Wait, I thought that's the whole idea, that it gets to camouflage ones.
Oh, no, son, not that little tiny top, praise God. There's some things that are not camouflage.
Okay, so I know which one you're talking about now.
Yes, I know it's the real deal. And I also would never just wear that because I recognize that is really Indian culture. Right. However, if I was back in India, I would probably take them with me because it would be appropriate in that context. In the context, yes. In that context. But would I wear them here, even if I was trying to, if it was a dress up as a culture day, right? I probably would not wear it because that's not my culture. I would wear African, but I recognize my African clothes, of which I have quite a bit, as my clothes.
Right. Well, and you also have connections to experiences with, understanding of.
Yes.
And that to me, that's why we can't necessarily be the measuring stick for other folks. We have to self-reflect on the extent to which we are using the N word, the extent to which we are using the B word, the extent to which we are somehow feeling weird by putting on something that is not ours.
So while we're in this appropriation discussion, I want to go to a post that we both commented on back in September, and it was from Dante McGilvery. He had a post about the first Chinese production of A Raisin in the Sun in Beijing.
Right.
And I remember my comment, I had not read the article at that point, but I remember my comment being, well, maybe they're trying to do a raisin in the sun so that it can help them understand African-American culture. It's a real tool and talking piece. Then I read the article, praise the Lord, and I recognized—
It's amazing what reading will do, isn't it?
Honey, right. I learned my lesson because you commented behind me. And, and when I read the article, I recognized that they were trying to— they were using prosthetics. They were really trying to embody the characters in the play in the context, not their own cultural context, but in this African-American context. And then I thought, oh, that's a little problematic. But how if they wanted to explore, because I would hate to think that there are plays that just cannot be done anywhere else. Is there a way they could have explored doing that a little better than putting on prosthetics to kind of look like Black people and
Absolutely.
act like Black people? How would they have done that better? Because I really thought it was a good idea, and well, now I don't.
Well, first I would say that there are lots of Black theater troupes in need of some work. So one thing they could do is invite a Black theater troupe over to perform. We do that all the time. If we're having Hopi hoop dancing,
yeah,
we would invite Hopi dancers in to do it. So invite those folks in. What also makes this suspicious is they claimed that they were not doing blackface, they were doing brownface. But that's the same thing. It's the same difference. And China has its own history of anti-blackness that is not under the surface. It is very real. I've been to China. So that could be very interesting is let's say we all read the play, and let's say that we either watched the movie or invited a troupe in and then had a discussion with the troupe about the play and the issues of race in it. That is such a specific historical context. I just taught this last week in my own class, actually this week, Monday, in my own class. That is very specific. That is not some universal play. This is about a Black family moving into Chicago, and they're going to be likely bombed or otherwise harassed for moving in there. And it's also about the particulars of economics and generational wealth. Those are very particular historical moments in this country that putting on a prosthetic and some wigs, that's not going to solve that. In fact, I would wonder if that would distract people.
Right.
Because somebody has to interpret what Black people look like. Do you see what I'm saying? So somebody's going to come up with what do these Black people look like? And Black people don't look the same. Why pretend you got some Black folks? Invite some Black people in and do it.
Yeah,
and have a conversation with them about it.
And really learn. As you were talking, I was reflecting on when I was in high school. So I graduated in 1984. We did a play. I cannot remember the name of the play, but there is in the play, there was an African-American couple that the woman played was the maid, and it was her spouse. And I recognize that, well, what they did in the play was they just let two white people play them, because I went to an all-white school. I was the only African-American in my class, and I was the assistant director, so I wasn't in the play. Right. Mm-hmm. So they had to have white people play this part. Mm-hmm. And I remember clearly now that the girl said, well, we just kind of darkened our makeup to kind of get us more in character. I recognize now how poorly that was and how it never should have happened. But the question I have is, what about these schools that do not have people of color and they want to do a production that has people of color? Mm-hmm. What do? Do they rewrite that so it fits their context, or what do they actually do? Because we don't want plays to go by the wayside that have some real cultural value to them.
Keep in mind that a play is really the story, and it's the story that will resonate. You can have, we say that all the time, particularly now as we're coming up with Halloween, is that young kids can be in costume without having to blacken their faces. There are other ways that you have to convey the character. If you're going to be Martin Luther King, for example, you don't need to, do your face. You can dress up, walk around with your "I have a dream" speech. So there are ways in which that becomes an easy way for people not to exercise creativity, just blacken the face. And because of all the history, we can't just sort of tease all the history out of that any more than we can tease the history out of the N-word.
So a little white boy could actually dress up at Martin Luther King for Halloween, even though we're nervous about that, but still, they can dress up as him. They can portray him, whatever. They might have an admiration for him.
What he says. We do it all the time in those games like Taboo. You're this character. say what the character will say, give me some context. Nobody goes in and puts on blackface and you got a white character.
So that is, and so we don't have to be offended by that. Someone showing their, and what I recognize is they could have just, it was in the South, they could have just played Southern. They didn't have to play Southern Black.
That's it. Well, because that takes on a whole level of performance. And I have it in my class when we're reading aloud, and especially with white students, since most of the students I teach are white. If it's a Black character, they somehow think they have to read it like it's Black. But when you start reading it like it's Black, that's when you move into this sort of dangerous stereotype.
Stereotypes.
The play will stand on its own. And
yeah. And that's, well, that even becomes, well, there are some regional dialects that you can use without having to be so obtuse in that so that you exaggerate it. When you exaggerate it, that's when you start going into the stereotypes. So while we're on this appropriation conversation, what's hitting the airways now is that Cleopatra is going to be played by Gal Gadot. Gal Gadot. And even though she does have some Middle Eastern background, that is her heritage, people are upset because she is actually not North African, that she doesn't embody all of who Cleopatra is. Is there a point that we take things too far if there is, let's say there is no North African who can play this part? Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but
it's likely not. It's likely not.
Likely not.
This is where it gets into that area where people will say, oh, it's acting. And it's the same sort of conversation when we have, heterosexual actors playing LGBTQ characters or cisgender characters playing transgender characters. The reality is that we don't take enough time and energy to find people who can represent. That's why Pose has been such a popular show, is because they actually have trans characters playing trans characters. I frankly understand the history of that. I'm not a fan of the show because I'm bored by the stories, but it's not because they're not trying to find. I think the issue is that for so long, people who were not Black were being played by white characters. For so long, men were playing women's characters in Shakespeare productions. So that's what the issue is why are you not playing someone who looks like you? You can still act, but you're presuming that one can't act who is of that identity. So that's what I'm saying. It takes extra effort to do that. It's not saying that you can't do it. And, keep in mind the history of Cleopatra is that she was Elizabeth Taylor.
Yes. They call the roll of everybody and they say this is more of that white supremacist trying to whitewash what Africa looks like. And the first question that came to mind was, but if she's got the Middle Eastern, that's just not good enough. And I think that's what people might be asking. Why isn't the fact that she still has Middle Eastern heritage, which they believe is part of Cleopatra's heritage? Right. Why isn't that good enough?
Because the history has primed us for this. If for years and years we hadn't always seen a Cleopatra or a Jesus or a God that didn't look like us, then we want something that looks closer to what we have imagined that could be, instead of just falling in line with what has always been. So I think that's part, is that we can't just sort of pretend that history doesn't exist. If there were ways in which, yes, same thing with Kamala Harris, for example. For some folks, she's not Black enough.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
But here's the question.
Oh.
So if they had picked an African-American woman to play Cleopatra, would that have been acceptable just because she would look more the part?
I think there's so much that's about optics and what things look like, because we can't look at you and know exactly what your identity is when you're playing a part that is clearly African. But so many people didn't even know that Egypt is in Africa. So that again is a whole lot of education that has to go. And part of this is, I can't look at you and know that you've got one drop of Black blood, but I know what our American history is when it defines you as not white, and all of the disparaging disadvantages you had as a result of that. I think that's what the issue is.
I was in a class with a young man who was Egyptian. Beautiful. He was beautiful. And I said, oh, you're African. And he said, no, I'm not. I'm Egyptian. And I said, that's interesting. And he said, well, no, understand. You don't call yourself North American. You don't call yourself by your continent. You call yourself by your country. And so for him, he was like, I'm not African, I'm Egyptian, but I recognize that Egypt is a part of Africa. What are your thoughts on his take on his identity? And when I tell you he was this robust and beautiful brown young man, he was beautiful. He was beautiful.
My first response to that is that anti-blackness persists globally.
Yeah.
And that could be a way, because Africa has been so disparaged.
Yes.
As you know, we didn't even know it was a continent at one point. We kept calling it a country. But anything that needs help, we never talk about, or rarely talk about, until Wakanda, for example, the riches of Africa. Right. And I think that people inside can also sort of disparage what they're, you know, and you're absolutely right. We talk about America and we don't say North American. In fact, when we talk about America now, we have to make sure that we talk about US and not Latin America or Central America. So there are ways in which I'm glad that people are thinking about it, but I certainly wouldn't go in to second guess how one self-identifies.
Correct.
But I will say that we could probably trace a lot of anti-blackness, anti-African that is global and part of the diaspora to how people inside think about that. We certainly think that was true of South Africa.
Correct. And I wish I could see him, ask him today, because I would love to delve deeper into that conversation. But how, you know, we think about how we call ourselves.
Right.
African Americans started, we were Negro, colored,
sometimes capital N, sometimes
Black.
Right.
We've had a lot of different names, and so people who are not Black get very confused on how do I identify you. If I needed to identify you, and so recognizing that even my saying that is problematic, but still.
I understand. Right.
How do white people, or anyone who's not Black, African American, Negro, colored, pick whichever, because every generation got their word. How do they know? And is there something to us and how we've been naming ourselves?
Well, a couple of pieces of that. One is to listen to how people name themselves. So listen, because I did that relative to my relationship with that NFL team. That name that I won't call.
Yes.
But initially I was, the ally who was out there writing, blogs for teaching tolerance and using the word. Now I would never say it, but I would use it. Then I listened to some indigenous colleagues who started saying it's the R word. And so I then started saying, that R, the group, the name R. And then I heard yet another say, I don't even give it that. Just say that NFL team over there in Washington.
Right.
And so part of that was me listening to other people. Now, I can tell you that didn't backfire, but I experienced that, a lawyer had reached out wanting some help on a case with the N-word. And this white lawyer, because, we can read race over the phone and hear race over the phone in the same ways that we can mostly do gender like that. He used the word. And I stopped him saying that you've heard me using the euphemism this whole conversation. You and I can't work together because you're not listening to what I'm saying. And I'm not using it. Why are you using it? So that's what I'm saying. Part of that is to listen. But the other thing is to ask in the same way that we would ask someone who is blind if that person needs the door opened, rather than assuming that a blind person can't operate if we're not there. So part of this is respecting the person and asking the same thing we talk about gender, not making assumptions about people's gender based on what they look like. And I've fallen into that trap. And people have misgendered me from behind just because they saw long hair. I was at a Barnes and Noble and somebody, standing in line, and this person says, "Oh, excuse me, ma'am." And so I looked around. And, even my now deceased uncle, when I decided to grow locks, said, "Oh, do you want to be a woman?" So there are ways in which the optics of these things play into how we make assumptions. So now, instead of, thinking being polite, yes, excuse me, ma'am or sir, just say, excuse me, you with the red shirt on. Because particularly now, since we're becoming more aware of transgender issues, it can be highly problematic to assume people's gender based on looking at them and not asking them what are their pronouns.
Absolutely. And the truth is, if you are someone who's uncomfortable with the recognizing that pronouns shift and change because that is just where we are culturally, you just gave somebody out. Just excuse me, in the black shirt.
Right, exactly.
And just that way you're not putting yourself at odds with someone that you're not endeavoring to put yourself at odds with, because you don't know, they don't know, they don't know you. You don't know.
I say the same thing, and this may be a little different given your position and all that. But I tell people in my privilege and bias work, I said, that's why we don't talk about these things as political correctness. I said, when we're talking about people's livelihood and we look at the ways in which transgender people are still being killed and not acknowledged in Black Lives Matter, I said, it's not about political correctness, it's about people's lives and livelihood. And I said, that's why, to me, it is not politically correct to just tell people happy holidays, because that's all encompassing. What if you go up to somebody talking about Merry Christmas and they are Jewish and don't discover or celebrate that? There's also, in happy holidays, you can get New Year's in there, you can get Hanukkah in there, you can get Kwanzaa in there. So why not just be all encompassing, and instead of trying to make a big deal out of or some point about insisting that everybody is a believer, because the reality is that everybody's not. And I just discovered this recently. There is a whole bunch of folks out there in the world, Black folks, who are non-believers.
You're kidding.
No, I'm not talking, because here's, and this is what I'm saying about I'm always learning. It was exactly a year ago in December that I was asked to sit on a panel of secular humanists. I had no idea what that meant. All that meant is that they don't believe in God in the ways that people do. And what I discovered is that there are lots of Black folks who are closeted, because if you're Black in this country, you have to have some kind of faith system. And for some people, it's not there. Sometimes it's from bad experiences they've had. And I say that if we're supposed to be accepting, then we have to accept on some level, because we're not judging them about what they're doing, but they're closeted and they don't have any way to meet with folks. So all I'm saying is that just ask and not make the assumption.
Just ask. And everything you said doesn't challenge me at all. I'm the gal who's trying to teach people about culture. And I just had this meeting earlier today, and I said what Paul did. Paul went into every city and he got an understanding of the culture. He did. And it's just not a bad thing to do, especially if you call yourself Christian and you're supposed to be a witness for Jesus Christ. You can be a witness to nobody if you don't know nothing. And you assume you like me. Shut it down.
I keep saying, to me, it was just astounding because there's so many parallels. I still haven't, I'm still where I am. But I think what's interesting is that sometimes we inherit these traditions and we can't be critical of the traditions that we hold. Right. And I can tell you, even in the lay committee at the church that I go to, we did something on white supremacy and how Christianity upholds that. And part of that is through sexism, part of that is through homophobia, part of that is through all of these other systems that we have used the map of white supremacy that are there. And that's a hard conversation for Black folks to have, because we've been wed and that's all that we know.
And and when you say wed, honey, it is ball and chain. It's not even a marriage. It's a prison. We've had the same kinds of conversations, especially, when it comes to sexuality and all of that.
Yes.
And you know how you wanted to shake people and say, the reason why they don't like Christians, because we're so intolerant. We're so angry. We're so mad. We act like that, you are just so apostate. And it's like, Jesus didn't act like that. with the people.
I know that's what I'm saying. And I bring it back to something that my project Humanities has tried to work on for the last 5 years,
Yes,
something
yes.
called Humanity. And the idea is if somebody is drowning, I hope that we don't have to ask, so what's your sexual identity? So what's your race? So what party do you vote with? I hope that we would sort of do whatever we could to save them. And I don't mean saving in a way that we're talking, some people go door to door saving people.
Yes.
Because I guess I just try to, part of this is why I would be sort of labeled by some as some extreme leftist, is that I really try to sort of look at things from multiple perspectives, but also not subscribe to something that I can't think through and make a decision about, instead of inheriting something just because it was there. Like James Baldwin says in his documentary, I Am Not Your Negro, it's because I love America that I can critique her, because I care about her.
Yeah.
And I want her to be better. And, that's sometimes what we do with people that we love, is that we care enough about them to sort of do what we can to support and help them. And if they're traveling in a road that feels like it's potentially dangerous, as we have seen it, then you try to help. You don't just let people drown. Now, when I said that about the non-believers, that has opened my eyes. It has not changed or shifted anything about my own faith, but it has opened my eyes to the possibility of my own privilege of being a Black person in this country and being able to have a faith system that I can connect with regularly and out in the open and not have to apologize for that.
Yes.
And there are other faith systems. There's Buddhism. We did some African diaspora religions, but I have to say this. You may remember when we were together in August, and I mentioned the possibility of some other religions, and it was not well received. So there's a lot of, and I wanted to acknowledge that if we're talking about the diaspora, then we have to recognize that everybody didn't gravitate toward Christianity. That was my own point. That this was a bigger movement, and we had to resolve and reconcile the fact that Christianity has supported much of what we are still dealing with inside our own faith systems.
That's right. I'm
trying to say that very diplomatically.
And you did it very, very well. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
We talk about all the different kinds of privilege. We talk about white privilege. Mm-hmm. There is male privilege, but there is certainly Christian privilege. The challenge with our Christian privilege is that it is splintered all over the place, right in through here, that makes the entire world look at the Christian church and say, if that's who you are, I don't know if I necessarily even want to be a part of you, because y'all don't play well together. So we have to, and you'll be surprised. I try to teach, just because you see someone walk through the door, they look like you, they might even act like you. Mm-hmm. It does not mean, one, they're of your same faith. And if they are of your same faith, they may not have been in the faith as long as you. They might have only met Jesus yesterday. And you're expecting them to act in such a way that they've been a Christian for all 53 years of their life, which is, you wouldn't expect a brand new baby to be able to digest food like you would at 53. And trust me, at 53, I don't digest some of the stuff I used to well. So.
Well, and I understood from my teachings that this is about a process and not about a product. Like you get your graduation, like I have my degree from this university and now that's it. I don't have to do anything else because I got my degree. Right. And so that to me is that in and of itself is a kind of linear, masculinist, Western way of thinking. I tell the students all the time, please don't tell me about a character who discovered herself or himself. I said, because people don't discover themselves. They potentially evolve because we can't predict what we will do because we haven't experienced all the circumstances. Right. So instead of saying you discovered yourself, when you discover yourself, you're static, man, you're dead, because it means there's no more discovery to come after that. So if you're in a process, you're continually discovering things. And I said this before, as I do this work in privilege and bias, I am continually understanding and learning more. And that to me is exciting. Not like I know all there is to know and there's nothing else I can learn. then I'm dead, spiritually, metaphorically, figuratively.
Yeah, yeah. Dr. Lester, let me tell you, we could keep talking for another 2 hours because we haven't even touched on a whole bunch of topics. But you did touch a little bit on Project Humanities,
Yes.
and I would love for you
Sure.
to tell us a little bit about it.
Project Humanities is excited to be celebrating our 10th anniversary in 2021. So we will be doing something big in the fall of 2021 because we want the spring and the summer to play out so we can know where COVID is going to be cooperating or guiding us.
Right.
But it started when I served as administrator 10 years ago. And it was much like it is now, where there's an economic downturn. This is worse. But students and their parents were fleeing from humanities. And people were asking that question, what are you going to do with a humanities degree? You can't get a job, you can't have money. You're not going to be able to live successfully. And so my charge was to figure out how we could demystify humanities and not make humanities just about academic disciplines. And you start saying, well, it's English, it's language, it's film, it's history, it's philosophy, but rather doing humanities. And the model is the public humanities that I experienced on the board of the Arizona Humanities, where you take humanities out to the people, and that we all do humanities because we talk, listen, and connect. And so we've used this hand as the logo, which is many becoming one. And that's borrowed from Booker T. Washington, but it really is an opportunity to have workshops, performances, lectures, keynotes, symposia, where we bring individuals and communities to talk, listen, and connect. And we have 2 signature events. One we just did last weekend, which was a 3-day virtual Hacks for Humanity, where we built technologies around these principles. And I was very excited. It was our first time doing it virtually. We had over 100 people. What made it exciting was the fact that we had people globally and also nationally. So it was not restricted to in-house and in-state and in the city. But what was challenging is all the global time zones. And there were some incredible ideas that came out of this competition, where people came together, didn't know each other, and you didn't have to be a tech person in order to participate. So it's really about diversity and people coming with whatever their skill sets and their voices and perspectives and backgrounds to participate in community building. And then the other sort of balanced part of that is our homeless outreach, which has in its most robust form has been put on hold until it is safe for us to go out. 150 to 200 adults in downtown Phoenix experiencing homelessness, clothing, shoes, and toiletries. So we partnered with another group that is taking some things out that we are collecting, but being able to give them out in such a way that it's not allowing our clients to violate social distancing. So we have been doing some wonderful things to bring more diversity to ASU programming, but also to sort of remind the communities around ASU that we're also part of these communities. So your congregation has hosted at least 2 events for us, and we are very grateful. And notice that the events that we hosted weren't necessarily church events.
Right.
And that's the other thing, is that we like to go to this place where we recognize that churches and venues have multiple functions and can bring in new audiences. So we're excited because if the world certainly needs more of our acknowledging our humanity, more compassion, empathy, forgiveness, integrity, kindness, respect. And you know, this is alphabetical, but I could say the biggest thing and the hardest thing for many people is the self-reflection piece.
Yeah.
It's being able to see what we are bringing to the table instead of just looking at what's going on in other people's lives. And I certainly am trying to practice that, and it's not easy.
Well, as you can see, this is why I love talking to you.
Well, the feeling is mutual. I was looking forward to this too. I kind of like gasped because I thought we had such a good conversation. I thought, well, we'll just pick up where we were. Right. I know her. We're part of the same family. Right.
Yes,
so that's good.
Yes. So thank you so much for being.
You're very welcome. And thank you. I look forward to seeing what you come up with. And thank you for inviting me. As I said, I've watched your your interviews. You have some interesting people. So I'm honored to be in the midst of those you are inviting.
Well, thank you.
Okay. All right. Stay healthy.
You
All
too.
Right. And my regards to the other pastor.
I will give him your regards.
Whose name threw me off last time when you were like Warren. I was like, who's Warren? That's like, I would never call him Warren. Okay. To the other pastor. Okay.
Pastor whose name just happens to be Warren.
Okay. Good evening. Take care. All right. Bye-bye.
Wow, what a great conversation that I have had with Dr. Lester. I hope you have enjoyed all of the subject matter that we have talked about, all the way from the N-word, what it means, all the way through to cultural appropriation, down to even the differences in culture and the culture clash that we even have within the Christian church. What a blessing it was to be able to traverse all of those different topics with Dr. Lester.